Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always ready to learn something new.
Well, today we're tackling this fascinating collection of writings all about gay masculinities. It's kind of a topic we all think we have a handle on. But
I think it's going to surprise us, yeah.
yeah, I think there are some assumptions floating around that we're going to challenge today. So this collection, it's got everything: history, modern subcultures, relationships, risk-taking, how class and race play a part, even the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Lots to dig into.
Yeah, it really highlights the complexity of this topic, doesn't it? Moves us way beyond stereotypes, that's for sure.
No one-size-fits-all definition of masculinity, that's for sure, especially when we're talking about gay men.
Right, exactly. And I think to understand how we got here, it's helpful to look back a bit, see how the concept of masculinity itself has changed over time, even outside the gay community.
Like one of our sources, Kimmel, he talks about the Victorian era.
Oh yeah, strict social rules, all that.
Exactly. He says men had this intense pressure to always be displaying their masculinity.
It's like they were constantly performing just to be seen as a real man.
Always proving themselves. And then, late 1800s, things get even more interesting. Doctors start using this term, sexual inversion.
Right, for anyone who didn't fit those rigid gender roles.
And basically they're saying anyone who doesn't conform, especially gay men, they're deficient somehow, like a failed male.
Yeah. And they used their medical authority to, well, basically pathologize homosexuality. They linked it to this perceived lack of masculinity. The word they often used was sissies, really tied those two things together in people's minds: sexual orientation and weakness.
And that had to impact, well, generations of gay men, right?
For sure.
So how do we go from failed males to, well, the modern gay masculinity landscape?
Well, I think the gay rights movement, it was a huge turning point, obviously a positive thing, but it also led to sometimes this pressure to be hyper-masculine.
An overcorrection.
Exactly. And it caused all sorts of new tensions within the gay community. Suddenly you have this divide between effeminate and masculinized gay men. One of our sources, Harris, says it really well. Gay liberation, while achieving so much, also created, and I quote, a whole new set of problems in gay men's self-images.
They traded one set of pressures for another.
It seems that way.
And then on top of all that, there's this whole idea of risk-taking. This author, Linneman, he suggests that for many gay men, just being themselves is a risk.
Yeah, challenging those expectations, defying the norms, it can be seen as risky behavior, absolutely.
And he tells this story about Arthur, an African-American drag queen. For him, performing, it's a political statement, but it's also a personal risk.
He talks about the vulnerability, being on stage, a target for potential violence.
Hard to imagine having to worry about your safety just for expressing yourself.
Sadly, it's a reality for many. That fear, the pressure, it can lead some to conceal their identity altogether.
It's heartbreaking, that anyone would have to hide who they are just to feel safe. Okay, so we've talked about history, societal pressures. But how does this all play out in relationships?
Well, one of the key things to understand here is the idea of sexual scripts. These are those unspoken rules we have around sex and relationships.
Okay, go follow it.
And so often, those scripts, they're based on gender stereotypes, and that can create so much confusion and conflict, especially for young people.
So like there's a script for men, script for women, and how they're supposed to act.
Exactly. One of our sources, Muchler, he talks about how those scripts often contradict each other, like the romantic love script many girls are taught, finding the one, prioritizing emotional connection. But boys are often given this, what he calls an adventure script, emphasizing sexual conquest, not intimacy.
It's almost like we set people up for unrealistic expectations before they even start dating.
It really is. And so these scripts, they don't disappear in same-sex relationships, which makes things even more complicated.
So they're still dealing with these societal expectations.
Muchler, he did this research with gay youth, and he tells a story about John and Jake, this couple, struggling to balance their needs. John wanted monogamy, while Jake, he craved more sexual exploration. And it's a situation lots of couples face, but it really highlights how these societal expectations can be even tougher on gay men.
And then you layer on the whole issue of safer sex. Muchler points out it can be a hurdle even in the closest relationships. It's a lot to deal with.
Trying to navigate those conversations about HIV status, risk, it's tough even with someone you love and trust.
Absolutely. Okay, we've talked about history, pressure, relationships. I'm curious about how class and masculinity intersect here.
Okay, so this is where Donald Barrett comes in. He did all this research on working class gay men, a group that's often overlooked, he says.
Yeah, a lot of research focuses on middle-class experiences, I've noticed.
Right. So Barrett found that working class gay men, they feel this pressure to conform to both traditional masculine norms, stoicism, physical labor, and the expectations of the gay subculture.
Which can be totally different.
Very much so. And through his interviews, he found three categories of masculinity: assertive, easygoing, and withdrawn. Shows the different ways these men navigate their social and sexual lives and their feelings about being gay.
Again, emphasizing that there's no one experience.
No single working class experience, and that's so important to remember.
Absolutely. Now, one thing we haven't touched on yet, but it feels really important, HIV/AIDS. It had to impact, well, how gay men see themselves, how they're perceived.
Hugely. And Halkitis, one of the other researchers, he talks about this thing called the buff agenda.
The buff agenda. Okay, now I'm intrigued.
Yeah, it's this focus on being physically perfect, muscular, lean, and he links it directly back to all the anxiety around HIV/AIDS. When you're facing a deadly disease, looking healthy and fit, it becomes almost like a symbol of survival.
Of desirability even, maybe.
Exactly. It's a way to reclaim control in the face of fear, but it creates a whole new set of pressures.
It's complicated, isn't it, this balancing act?
For sure. Some guys see it as empowering, some find it oppressive. Halkitis found a whole spectrum of perspectives.
Makes sense. Even within a shared experience, people cope in different ways.
Yeah.
Okay, before we move on, I want to hit on something Ward brought up.
Mm.
She challenges this assumption that gay men are somehow beyond sexism.
Right, like just because they've faced discrimination, they can't be sexist. But she points out that assumption makes it harder to address sexism within the community.
So gay men, their experience with sexism might be different from straight men's, but still real.
Exactly. She even uses this term queer sexism to describe this dynamic, and she gives examples from her research of how it shows up in gay men's relationships with women. It's a reminder that, well, we all have blind spots, no matter who we are.
We do. We have to keep challenging ourselves. Okay, wow, we've covered so much ground already, and it's clear there's no easy answer to what is gay masculinity. It's complex, it's evolving, we've got so much more to discuss, so stick with us. We'll be right back.
This whole discussion about sexism within the gay community, it really makes you think about the bigger picture, doesn't it?
Like, how can we talk about masculinity without thinking about all the other things that play a part?
Right. Race, class, culture.
Like you were saying before with those working class gay men, sometimes those different parts of you are kind of at odds with each other.
Absolutely. And one thing that really jumped out at me in these readings was how gay men deal with masculinity in different cultures,
Ooh, that's interesting.
Like, for example, there's a whole section on Asian American gay men, and it challenges this idea that there's one universal gay experience.
I'd love to hear more about that. What kind of unique challenges are they facing?
Well, so Han, the researcher who focuses on this group, he talks about how collectivist cultures play a huge role, where family and social harmony are really valued.
So less about standing out as an individual and more about fitting in with societal expectations.
Exactly. And he talks about this intense pressure to conform to traditional gender roles. Get married, have kids, even if it means hiding who you really are.
And face comes into play here too, right? Like maintaining that sense of honor for yourself and your family.
Oh, absolutely. Coming out can be a huge risk for a lot of Asian American gay men because it could bring shame on the family. So it's this constant balancing act, trying to honor your culture while being true to yourself.
I can only imagine how hard that is to navigate those expectations.
Yeah,
Must weigh on you, on your relationships.
definitely. And it reminds us that self-acceptance, it's not a one-size-fits-all journey. Everyone's path is different.
So true. And I imagine it's a similar situation for Latino gay men, right? Where those cultural expectations around masculinity are strong.
Oh, definitely. You've got that whole concept of machismo, emphasizing male dominance and assertiveness. Cantu, he's one of the researchers who focuses on this group, and he says those expectations really clash with expressing homosexuality.
Right. And then you factor in the homophobia that exists in some Latino communities.
Exactly. Creates this really tough experience for these men.
It's like they're being pulled in two opposite directions by their own culture and society as a whole.
And don't forget, some of them also have to deal with immigration status, which adds another layer of vulnerability.
Oh, for sure. So many intersecting challenges. Okay, so we've got Asian American gay men, Latino gay men. Are there other cultural groups covered in this collection?
There are. It's a pretty diverse collection. But one section I thought was really interesting focused on the intersection of faith and sexuality, specifically within the Metropolitan Community Church of New York.
Oh, that's a church that's specifically welcoming to LGBTQ individuals, right?
Yes. And they interviewed 4 Latino gay men about their experiences reconciling their faith, their sexual orientation. I have to say, hearing their stories was so inspiring.
What were some of the key things they shared?
Well, one of the men, Miguel, he talked about how much shame he felt initially because he was attracted to men. He felt like he was dirty and that God wouldn't accept him.
It must have been so painful.
It was. But he said finding this church was like a lifeline. It allowed him to be both gay and Christian.
It's amazing how the right community can make such a difference.
Absolutely. And another guy, Alex, he described his faith as this armor, protecting him from all the judgment he was facing from the outside world. It gave him the strength to keep going.
It sounds like that church gave him a sense of belonging that he couldn't find anywhere else.
Exactly. And all 4 of these men talked about how important it was to find that community where they could be their whole selves,
Gay and Christian.
Yeah.
No judgment. It's really powerful.
It is. And it makes me think about friendships, The role of friends in the lives of gay men. I've heard this term chosen families. And I'm curious about how those relationships form.
Me too. Like, what makes them unique?
Well, one of our sources, he goes into that. He compares gay and straight men's friendships.
Oh, this is good.
He suggests that gay men often have deeper, more emotionally intimate friendships because they're not necessarily bound by those traditional masculine scripts that discourage vulnerability.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If you don't feel like you have to suppress your emotions, you're going to connect on a deeper level.
Right. And that leads to those strong bonds, families of choice, which can be especially crucial when your biological family might not be accepting.
Creating your own support system.
Exactly. But it also makes you think about those who don't have that support. That isolation can make you vulnerable.
Especially in a situation where there's a power imbalance.
Which brings us to another topic that's often overlooked. Gay male domestic violence.
I'll admit, that's not something I think about very often. It's almost like we assume domestic violence only happens in straight relationships.
Right. But one of our sources, Cruz, he really pushes back against that. He says it happens in same-sex relationships just as frequently.
So it's not about sexual orientation, but about power and control.
Exactly. And he also talks about how those societal norms around masculinity, the emphasis on dominance and aggression that can feed into violence.
Like, if you're taught that being a man means being strong and in control, it can be hard to recognize unhealthy patterns.
Absolutely. And Cruz shares some really powerful stories from gay men who have experienced abuse. It's a reminder that we need to talk about this issue more and support survivors no matter who they are.
I agree. Domestic violence is a serious issue, and it's important to remember that it can happen to anyone. Okay, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier. Drag. The role of drag in expressing masculinity. I find it so fascinating.
Me too. It's performance art, social commentary, all rolled into one.
Right. And shocked. His research on gay female impersonators,
Yeah.
He really digs into that.
He spent years with the drag community observing, interviewing performers, and his work really challenges how people view drag.
Like the idea that it's all about men wanting to be women.
Exactly. Shocked says it's more about playing with gender, pushing the boundaries of masculine and feminine.
So subverting those expectations,
Yeah.
creating something new.
Yes. He talks about how drag queens often embody this hyper-femininity that's both glamorous and powerful. But here's the thing. He argues that this performance can actually be a way of asserting masculinity.
Wait, so how can performing femininity be a way of expressing masculinity?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Really highlights how fluid gender is.
He does.
And he also points out that drag kings, women performing as men, they often have these more subordinate roles to the drag queens.
Okay.
Even in a space where gender is being challenged, those power dynamics can still be there.
Interesting. It's like a microcosm of society in some ways. We've still got a long way to go in terms of true gender equality.
We do. But drag can be a powerful way to explore those norms, challenge them. It makes you think.
It does. Wow. This has been such an eye-opening conversation. From those cultural differences to religion, relationships, it's all connected.
We've barely scratched the surface.
I know. It's obvious that gay masculinities are so multifaceted, constantly changing. There's always more to discover. Back for our final deep dive into gay masculinities. My brain's about to explode, I think.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
We've covered historical shifts, culture, social movements, stereotypes, relationships.
It really shows you how much goes into this idea of gay masculinity.
Exactly. So as we wrap up, I'm curious, what are you finding yourself thinking about most? What's really stuck with you from all this?
I think for me, it's the diversity of it all. We go into this thinking there's this one gay masculinity, and then we see all these different experiences.
All these different stories.
Yeah, and it reminds us that, well, gender doesn't exist in a vacuum. You can't just look at masculinity on its own, not with gay men.
Like it's always tied up with all those other social forces. Race, class, background, everything.
Right. And I think another big takeaway is we have to challenge those narrow definitions of masculinity.
Those expectations that hurt everyone, not just gay men.
Right, exactly. The
Yeah.
pressure to be hyper-masculine, to be stoic, all those things.
Like it boxes people in, doesn't it? Keeps them from really expressing themselves, connecting with others.
It really does. And this deep dive has also made me think about the power of community. How important it is to have people who get it, who support you.
Yeah, like those families of choice we talked about.
Yeah.
Especially when your biological family isn't there for you.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, as things change, as society becomes more accepting, what's going to happen to gay masculinity? What's it going to look like in the future?
That's a good question. Feels like we're at a turning point. Maybe those old definitions are finally starting to fade away.
I think you're right. And the key is to keep talking about it, to keep learning, to keep challenging our assumptions and celebrating all those different experiences.
Couldn't have said it better myself. A sense of hope and possibility, that's a good place to end, I think. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been fascinating. And to our listener, keep those questions coming. Never stop exploring this stuff. It's important.